Hi, this is Paul. Kerry, what's his name? Niehoff, I forget. He says it right at the beginning of the video. He's a church consultant, a church growth consultant. Some of you will get triggered by the first few minutes of this video that I'm linking to, so you might want to avoid it. Others of you won't. Anyway, he has had a number of conversations with Tim Keller over the years on his podcast, and he had this one. And I thought this one was really quite good, and I wanted to talk about it. So let's go.
An extensive bibliography. So what are the differences, maybe we'll start here, between the decline in the mainline church that we saw kind of a generation ago and the decline that we're seeing today in the evangelical church?
Well, the similarities are that both the mainline church a generation ago and now the evangelical church more recently have essentially hooked themselves up to a particular political program. Obviously, the mainline church just became essentially completely hooked up to the Democrats and to liberal progressive democratic politics, and saying that this is the only really Christian way to be. And that decline happened quite a while ago. On the other hand, back by the 70s, for example. On the other hand, the evangelical church has more recently made the same move. It has, as at least in the public's mind, I'm not saying this is true of every single person in the mainline or of the evangelical church, but largely, and in the public's mind, the evangelical church is seen as having hooked up to the Republican Party, especially to a very conservative wing of the Republican Party. And so in the same way, we have also, the evangelical church has sort of said, this is the only Christian way to be politically. And so I think the population on the whole sort of sees both churches as basically a power block and not really speaking to the transcendent issues that all human beings have.
Okay, so pause there. I know some of you got triggered by that. Just hold on to yourself. He's right. Now, I'm preaching on Matthew 13 this week, and I'm thinking a lot about inside-outside dynamics. I almost made a really snarky video. I just got back from Southern California, had a terrific Estuary meeting. We're continuing to plan the May conference. Details of that will be coming out soon. It's really interesting. So I almost made a snarky video about Christian YouTube. And then I did my Google Zeitgeist search on Christian YouTube and saw a whole bunch of Christian YouTube channels I had never seen before, and just didn't have the heart to make it. Inside let's say the mainline church, or the highly, let's say inside the highly politicized mainline church and the highly politicized evangelical church or fundamentalist church, that is the world people see from the inside. This is, we all have our beliefs. We can believe no other. Our beliefs are not voluntary. Our beliefs choose us more than we choose them in many respects. From outside, what he just described is very much how it looks. It's very low resolution. It's very polarized. Now, many people, I know this is hard for a lot of church people to believe, many people don't know any people who go to church in America. Part of what I realized when I watched this video is that I, too, have a perspective, and I don't mean a political perspective. Y'all have, those of you who watch this channel enough, know plenty about my perspective, but Keller's going to make some statements about racism and a bunch of other things. My evaluative tools are built on personal experience and the windows I have to the world through the books that I read, through the formerly through the mass media and now through the social media that I receive, through the people that I use to filter and search and select how I perceive the world. So people are going to have different huge estimations of the world. At last night's Estuary meeting, it was fascinating. We didn't Jacob was there and Richard was there, but almost nobody else there knew who I was, which is always fun, because these are people that have come to Vendanc's Southern California Estuary. It's enormously diverse. You've got just on a religious space, it's really interesting. It was all men in that group. My group here in Sacramento is increasingly women. It was all men in that group. And all of these men tend to be very low in agreeableness and very high in openness. And so they come to a group like this because they can speak freely. They can speak their mind. But we all have to try to and they were going on around many of the sort of hot button social issues. And again, they're all low in agreeableness and high in openness. And so they're talking about it all in their own way. And there's no way to sort of pin any of them down in terms of where they stand on this issue or that issue. But it just occurred to me how the reality of combinatorial explosiveness and the narrow sphincter of time and space naturally lead us to create hierarchies and salience models that bring things to the top, and we are in many ways so out of touch with the things that we choose to talk about, and also the ways that we try to gain purchase on a world too big for us to grasp. Okay, I'm going to say all of that. So what Keller just said about the church is very true from outside the church for people for whom church involvement or church knowledge is only through their media, their mass media, cable media, or social media sources. That's the view. Now, I know the church at a far higher resolution, and Keller basically said it. He said, you get down into church, you'll go into a conservative church in a red state, and you will find quiet Democrats. You go to a mainline church in a blue state, and you will find quiet Republicans. As the resolution goes up, the picture always gets more complex. But pay attention, when we're talking like this, we have to talk in really low resolution. And so all of these things are subject to further analysis, further exploration, and nuance. It's also important to remember that Keller is fundamentally a missionary. He's not a theologian. He's a pastor, evangelist, and his main job has been to be a church planter and help people who don't go to church to start going to church and to worship God and to change their beliefs and to change their behaviors. And this gets into some of the video that I made earlier this week about Tripp and Bethel's conversation with Sam.
I think what's interesting is the difference, by the way, is that whereas the mainline church jettisoned Orthodox doctrine, it jettisoned the idea of the authority of the Scripture and the deity of Christ and the return of Christ and all that.
Now, again, Keller is a church in the PCA, Presbyterian Church of America, which is a conservative split off from the Presbyterian Church, PCUSA, Presbyterian Church in the United States of America. The PCA is a conservative Reformed church whose doctrinal statements, I don't know how many, the Westminster Confession is the main one. And you usually sort of tag churches according to certain belief systems. They're very similar to the Christian Reformed Church, a little bit more conservative, let's say, on certain issues because they don't ordain women to the office of elder and minister. I think they might have deaconesses, but...
And they thought they were getting with the times, but what's actually happened is they're cut off now from 90% of the world church.
Okay. Remember that point right here. They're cut off from 90% of the world church. Think about that. A little bit later, he's going to talk about slavery. He's going to talk about what's remarkable, this close up. I mean, Keller, there's a lot of commonality in the background between Tim Keller and myself. He's a generation older than I am, but in terms of East Coast conservative, reformed, urban ministry. That's the same group that I come from. And, I look at his library and we've read the same books. I grew up on the East Coast just outside of New York City. The bulk of his ministry was in New York City. So there's a fair amount of social commonality, even though he's a generation older than I am. But this point, the mainline church is cut off from the world church, and he's going to go into that a little further.
Which is growing. And it's very embarrassing that, there's 2 million Episcopalians in America, a very liberal church. And yet, there's 11 million Anglicans in Uganda alone. Wow. And there's twice that much in Nigeria, and they're all Orthodox. And the same thing has happened for the Methodists. In other words, the church here is Methodist, it's sort of liberal, but worldwide Methodism is not. So they've actually cut themselves off from the growing edge of the church and the world church. Evangelicals have not.
Now, it's helpful here to note that Kelter's primary filter, now I'm not evaluating this filter, I'm a Christian Reformed minister in a confessional denomination, but I just want to name it and put it out there that this confessional Protestant categorization and belief system is the filter that Keller is using to evaluate the main line and to note that the main line is out of step with the ecclesiastical siblings that they have, especially in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, in the developing world, let's call it. And that's a really critical point, because a little bit later when he talks about the American Civil War, which is a key moment in the evolution of the American church, he'll notice that the pro-slavery churches in the southern part of the United States saw the world differently from their cousins that were, for example, in Scotland. And I would have liked him to draw those connections there too. But let's listen to a little more. And I want to jump to that part, and then I really want to get sort of to the end.
Which I think means, because we haven't cut ourselves off and because we haven't jettisoned Orthodox doctrine, at least not yet, we haven't, it means in some ways there's something there to be revived. And there's something there to be revived, especially because I believe, of course, Orthodox doctrine is true and biblical, but I also believe it keeps us in touch with the world church. And therefore, I have little or no real hope for any kind of renewal with the main line, but I have a lot more hope for renewal with the evangelicals. When I say a lot more, I mean that's a low bar compared to how I feel about the main line. The evangelicals, I'm still worried, very, very, very worried, but I do think there's something there.
Now, he's going to talk about some of the issues that some of you, and he's going to talk about them in the way that some of you hate him for. Hate is probably too strong a word. Some of you critique him for, and I know a lot in my audience. But now, what's interesting, what he doesn't do, and this is in fairness to some of the people who have criticized Keller, if he would use some of the same arguments a little later in the video and apply them to the main line, they would be devastating, because let's just play a little bit more and get into some of these issues.
No, and it is helpful, and yet you don't exactly whitewash the issues of the evangelical church. And in that paper, which again we'll link to, you do make a distinction between white evangelicalism.
Now, I had to do a little bit of clicking down to find the paper, but I'll put the link to the website that you can get this paper from, and then the paper itself. I haven't read the paper yet. I'm really interested in it because I think Keller is very sharp in his cultural exegesis.
And other forms of evangelicalism. And I'm not sure we'll have time to get into all 7 traits that mark the social history of white U.S. evangelicalism, but could you give us a little overview of how white evangelicalism is, because it's in a free fall right now, some of those traits and how that has become counterproductive?
Yeah.
Now, there's something to say about white evangelicalism versus black evangelicalism. If you take a look at sort of the standard church demographic and statistical studies, the surveying that has been done of the church, black Protestants are almost always in a separate category from white Protestants. Part of the difficulty of that categorization, it isn't that black Protestants don't deserve their own category, because in many ways, because of the history, because of how significant the Civil War was to the development of Christianity in America, and how significant a lot of Mark Knoll's work on the pioneer and frontier dynamics in American history were on the history of white evangelicals in America. These aren't bad categories to use in order to do some analysis and get some things. Now, part of what we're dealing with is that these terms have been used to such a degree that, and by so many critics, that they have a new valence that sort of rushes in, and right away we're having a conversation that there's sort of a presumption of guilt. White evangelicals, this is actually a tremendously difficult category to talk about. For example, in Sacramento, there are a lot of immigrants from the former Soviet bloc in Sacramento. Are they white? I remember when my kids were going to high school here, one of my sons, he was white, not Russian. That's what the kids called him, because there are so many Russians. And they knew that sort of generic white, if there is such a thing, was different from the Russians, the Russian immigrants. There's a significant charismatic evangelical community in the United States from the former Soviet bloc. Are they lumped into that group? So part of the resolution that we're dealing with here sort of needs more nuance, but in what's effectively sort of a half-hour interview that they have here, you don't drill down into it. Now Keller's going to spend some time talking about race, and this is where I think some of my differences come in that I have not spent much time in the South. Racism in the northern parts of the United States is different from racism in the Midwest, is different from racism on the West Coast. I've seen that my whole life. I've never lived in the old slave states of the United States. I would expect that racism and race relations are different there too. So there's a ton of nuance there, and Keller has. I treated Keller's document a little bit. He has some ideas about what he thinks the evangelical church should do, and let's listen to a little bit more.
I can name them at least, and that way,
Sure, yeah.
whether we can go into them or I can name them. And
please.
well, one is there's a moralism. It tends to be moralistic, which means self-righteous. It's separatist, which is in general white evangelicalism, or you want. Some people are going to say this is just fundamentalism. Okay, well we can talk about that, but fundamentalism and evangelicalism are in some ways just joined at the hip, and it's always very hard to tell quite where the divide is. But the point is, conservative evangelicals are moralistic and self-righteous. They tend to be separatistic. They don't really like to engage. They feel like it's compromising. They see good and evil in kind of Manichaean ways. We just have to denounce and withdraw. Okay.
And now, again, these are generalizations, and I'm not sure. I'm sure they're apt for some groups and some churches. Are they apt across the board? What percentage? Again, when you're talking this way in such a short interview, there's almost no way to escape broad generalizations. But the difficulty is that when you talk this way, you begin to, and especially if you're sort of an authority like Tim Keller is in many respects, you tend to reinforce the low resolution takes that we see in the world. And you can find examples of everything that he points to, positive and negative, but you can also find huge swaths of the church that just don't fit into this. For example, Assemblies of God churches. I mean, the charismatic Pentecostal churches are tremendously is the Assemblies of God white? And if you know anything about the Assemblies of God, I mean, for example, we've had the church across the street from us. When I got here, they were an Assemblies of God church. They sold the building. A Russian church came and removed all the asbestos themselves. Didn't pay all of those high-priced asbestos removers. I watched them haul all that stuff out of the church. When they sold the church, they sold it to an Assemblies of God bilingual Hispanic church. Churches are really hard to categorize. So he's got he does a fair amount of this analysis in this way, but
Number three, they're very individualistic. It's all about just me and getting myself right and getting to heaven. Four, it's dualistic, which goes together with individualism. It's dualistic where it basically tends to, pit Christianity against culture. We either withdraw from culture or we fight it, but there's no idea of that there's. It goes along with the separatism, but it's there. In other words, the world is bad and everything in the church is good. Instead of seeing that the world has got common grace and the church has got, sin in it, but instead dualism, it's like it's all good or evil. Anti-intellectualism is a major trait of American evangelicalism. You don't see it in the British as much, for example. When you take, why is it that when I was first coming to be a Christian in 1970, in the 70s, why is it that almost as a college-educated kid, everything I read, whether it was C.S. Lewis or J.I. Packer or John Stott, they were all British. And it's because in America, you just have an anti-intellectualism, and you just really didn't have books written for college-educated people.
Now, there's definitely anti-intellectualism in American culture. I don't deny any of his categories, but the difficulty is, it's, look at everything that happened in the neo-evangelical movement. You're not going to find anti-intellectualism at Wheaton or Calvin or many of the other institutions. Now, are these tendencies? Yes. Are they more so in the United States? Yes. Is that a product of the frontier movement? Yes. So, okay, we're going to name these things. But part of the difficulty here is that, again, we're tending to reinforce the stereotypes.
Then there's an anti-institutionalism, which means evangelicals just like to set up their own shop, their own organizations. They just don't like to become part of existing institutions and existing organizations. They like to do it themselves. Highly entrepreneurial, but also anti-institutional. So this stuff just they don't build things that last. And finally, Enculturation. That is to say, there's a tendency to wed Christianity to American culture. So it's the reason why,
And again, these are generalizations, almost stereotypes in some case. There's validity to them. I don't really disagree that this is out there, but this process tends to, the last point, I think it's nearly universal. Again, a woman in Italy, it's really sort of a woman was elected in Italy, and I saw this whole video from Unheard about how, it's God in Italy. And as I've said many times, nationalism and religion are really tight. And it's a little bit different for Roman Catholics. I wonder if I think it's more different for Catholics perhaps than the Orthodox, because the Orthodox churches that have come into the West have, in many respects, come in with their national tag still on them. Antiochian Orthodox. Now, it's not a tag. Greek Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox. And so, yeah, that's here, but it's almost always a part of the package. And again, I don't think these are bad windows through which to view some things, but
say there certainly is grounds for the gender roles. I think the Bible does talk about there's differences between male and female, but there's a tendency amongst evangelicals and fundamentalists in America to exaggerate those and basically read anything traditional American gender roles back into the Bible. Also, there's nationalism, which is the idea that we're the greatest country in the world. You kind of read your Americanism back into the Bible.
Now, when I listen to this list, I very much recognize my roots, the conversations and discussions that I grew up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I hear the window through which the culture was seen 20 some years ago, and this is part of my critique on his piece too. I'm not saying any of these elements are wrong necessarily. They're certainly there. It's very difficult to sort of calibrate them and figure out, okay, how much is this working? And it's certainly more true in certain parts of the country than other parts of the country. I think it probably tends to be more true on the East than in the West, although we've got some of that here too. So, but I don't know that this framework remains the best framework through which to try to do analysis of, let's say, a revival of the church in the United States. And I think that because I don't think there's really a going back. And I look at that through the lens of my own denomination, the Christian Reformed Church. There's no going back to the church that my grandparents grew up in, where, I mean, I could give a list of things of the Christian Reformed Church before the Second World War that radically changed by the 1960s, and a list of things from the Christian Reformed Church in the 1960s to the 1970s that radically changed, even for many of the conservative, let's say, churches in agricultural America and Canada today. There's just been massive change, which means that the real quest is to figure out, well, what is faith going to look like? And from everything that I think we've seen, that I've seen in my little place seeing the world, I don't know that sort of a simple holding orthodoxy or loosing orthodoxy, which seems to be sort of the filter through which, let's say, a lot of Christian YouTube sort of sees the world, is really going to hold. Because my experience has been, it's not that doctrines are necessarily abandoned. It's that there's almost always very slow, subtle movement beneath the categories that has them functioning different in a new cultural system. And this is why you tend to see new issues emerge that weren't emerging before. In other words, the dynamic is quite a bit more sophisticated.
And so there we are: moralism, separatism, individualism, dualism, anti-intellectualism, anti-institutionalism, enculturation. And if you want to find,
and again, I could have constructed that list in college and seminary in the 1980s, and that would have been the list. I look at the world today and I think, yeah, those things are still around. But I don't know that those are in any way the key issues. That if, for example, if you could really address all of them in the way that you would prefer, that somehow you could recapture the church of a certain date between 20 and 75 years ago. I just don't think history works that way. And with the radical changes that we've seen via information technology, I don't think there's any going back. And in fact, and again, I know some of you will hear this and say, well, it's doctrine slipping. I don't think that's the proper lens through which to view it. Not that I'm promoting doctrine slipping. If you read the church order, the Christian Reformed Church, the entire thing is a determined effort by a community not to change doctrine and dogma, even though change has come about all the way through the whole lifetime that I or my father or grandfather have lived in the church. And a lot of the changes coming about in ways that aren't necessarily mapped onto the doctrinal or confessional roadmap where the church is. For example, I was just thinking about how the integration of, there's already artificial intelligence built into Google and Bing, but the incorporation of Chat GDP, which has been sort of making all the headlines now. You can have it write a sermon, you can have it write a book, you can have it tell you exactly how to change a baby's diaper or make a grilled cheese sandwich. All of this stuff, when that's incorporated into a major search engine built into the browser of the number one operating system creator in the world, basically designed to unseat Google, it doesn't mean that conversations about Christology are going away. I just got a nice, I was just listening to Chad's conversation with Chris Green about beauty and Christology. And so these categories aren't going away, but whereas 80 years ago, the concern in the Christian Reformed Church was not Roman Catholicism. They were out there. Methodism was the concern in the Christian Reformed Church, that the Christian Reformed Church would slowly become more like the Methodists, meaning sort of the evangelicals. Catholics, so they were far away. 40 years ago, well, sort of, CRC increasingly evangelical. The concern was that the Christian Reformed would become, anti-Catholicism was still a big piece of it, but the concern was, let's say, doctrinal slippage, and then you had the fight about women in office. So I don't know that I think the landscape has changed quite a bit since the creation of that list. Again, it's not a bad list, but when I listen to evangelicals fight, I just think you're fighting over what you were fighting in the 1980s. And the world is changing, this free fall that's happening. I don't know that addressing that list that he just laid out is going to do anything about that free fall.
Find out where they came from. You got to kind of read both Nate Hatch, his book, The Democratization of American Christianity,
and definitely read Nate Hatch and Mark Knoll and George Marsden. So I looked at this. So this is the doctrine, not the doctrine. This is the document he started, and his bibliography is my bibliography. I mean, he's reading the same things I am. Yuval Levin, Christopher Lash, Tom Holland. Tim Keller and I are from the same place, a generation apart, reading the same books, believing mostly the same things. We're really close, but when I listen to this analysis, I think, well, and he's got stage 4 pancreatic cancer, so I'm not going to lean into him too much. But from what I've seen over the last 5 years, I think the laundry list and the setting of the table is outdated.
And Mark Knoll stuff. And basically they essentially say that kind of what happened back in the 1820s and 1830s, American evangelicalism, in order to really grow on the frontier, had to go to a less educated ministry. It just went it went populist in the 1830s. It's a long story. And you know what? I've already taken too long on this question.
And he's right. And again, I read the same history he reads, and I agree with it. It took a populist turn, but it's been taking a populist turn. It's continued to morph over the last 20, 30 years too. and significantly and faster.
Podcast is not lasting 3 hours, so I should make my questions a little shorter. But they explain why American evangelicalism has been so anti-intellectual, populist, of the people, but then really not trusting the academy, the university, not trusting science, just not trusting, people with degrees, just not trusting them. So.
Yeah, and which of those, like if you had to pick a couple, and maybe it's a false question, and if so, we can move on, but which of those do you think in this moment has become the most damaging? Because I was just looking over the Barna data this morning, doing some writing, and I mean, we are in a bit of a free fall. There's a little uptick after, but when you look at Gen Z, I mean, they're spiritually open, but Christianity is just not very interesting to younger adults.
Well, if you read those seven,
I don't know that that's the case, because there's just a lot of people who've gotten very interested in different kinds of Christianity.
I don't think I'm going to pick one out. They really are involved with each other. The seven, when I was working on it, I could have made it 3, I could have made it 5, because they kind of overlap. But I broke them out because I think it's a I'm trying to think here. Is there a way for me to summarize it? It's I think the two things would be the moralism and the fear of in a kind of, I don't want to be mean here, a kind of fear of ceremonial impurity. I'm going to I'm just going to be harmed if I read this book, or if I associate with these people. And see, that is moralism. Ultimately, it's not the confidence. Jesus was eating with.
And I agree with Keller on those points. And again, if you look at Christian YouTube, it's full of it.
Prostitutes and sinners and people like that. And the religious leaders of the day were saying, how could he, if you're a real man of God, why would you have anything to do with him? And because Jesus understood who he was, and he understood the gospel of grace, he was just not afraid of being made impure. And I do think that I really do think a lot of evangelicalism, they can articulate the gospel, I'm saved by grace, not by works. But deep in its heart, it's pretty moralistic. And the way you do that is you stay pure, and you keep your doctrine right, and you live in all these ways, and then you start looking down on people, and you separate from people. So I think it's the moralism, the lack of grasp of the gospel. And the particular.
Now, it's when you listen to Keller, it's really helpful to understand the. Oh boy, I got to be careful with this, because I want to be accurate. Because I'm not denying, because again, confessionally, he and I are on, we're just a hair's difference apart. Hair's difference in terms of ecclesiology, a bit perhaps. But he and I are, and he's been deeply influential in me. And what happened in the 90s with the emergence of the Young, Restless, and Reformed. Remember, the Young, Restless, and Reformed, the 1970s, you have the born again movement in American Christianity. Chuck Colson is going to go to prison for what he did in the Nixon administration, and his life is a mess. And he's talking to some Christians in Washington, and this is summary. You can't find it as such in Born Again, which is a very interesting read now, a number of decades later. I mean, he basically comes home and says, I'm a Christian, and his wife is like, I thought we were Episcopalian, and so you have Jimmy Carter's this born again president. So you have this rise of, it's really sort of this separation. The 1970s is tremendously important in terms of the church. Even in the Christian Reformed Church in the 1970s, you had the beginning of the fight over women in office. You had the 1973 report on sexuality. You had a significant report 44, as it became known, significant report on interpretation of Scripture. It's like all of these things happened in the 1970s, and we're still sort of playing out what happened in the 70s after this counterculture. So then you have the 1980s, which basically kept an evangelical structure of Christian belief and salvation, but added this seeker veneer on it. And the seeker movement in some ways is connected to today's wisdom movement, in that if you go to a seeker church, you go to Bill Hybels' church, you go to Rick Warren's church, you would find sort of a revivalist, contemporary music, high quality music presentation, so people aren't going to be offended by the music. They're going to like the music. You got a concert quality music on a Sunday. You've got good coffee. Your children are going to be cared for in a safe environment, and the message is going to focus on wisdom, and the validation of the gospel is going to be, we have wisdom to help you improve your life. You're going to have a better marriage. You're going to save more money. You're going to be a better worker. Your children are going to behave better. We're going to teach you how to run your life. And the key to all of this is becoming a Christian and bowing your knee to Jesus and going forward in that way. That's the key. And so the seeker movement, this huge movement, it's also important to remember that the West is huge and the United States is huge. So there are times and places, or there are places in the United States where the seeker movement is still going on big time. Non-denominational megachurches in Southern California, in the Midwest, not so much out east, I don't know, but so that's still going. But as Gen Z, the seeker movement, they began. So I went to Willow Creek a number of times in the 90s, and the seeker movement began to understand, because again, read Molly Worthen's Apostles of Reason. Neo-evangelicals have always really paid a lot of attention to social science. And this, again, is where Keller's critique, and he knows all this. He's given a half-hour interview, so I'm in no way trying to kneecap him. He's going in short sound bites. But again, even that is an element of pre-YouTube. So Willow Creek decides, they see that, wow, our methods are really hitting home runs with boomers, white boomers, but not just white boomers. It's going well. Willow Creek is helping planting churches all over the place. It's working well in Hispanic communities. It's black communities. Antioch Progressive, that's American Baptist, that's down the street from me. They built a massive building. But again, the dynamics in the black church are always different. And that's a whole nother story. So the seeker movement begins to notice that it isn't working so much for the Xers. And so then they hire Xander, I think his last name, or first name. I don't remember. They hire a young guy. They retune the music to be a little bit more Gen X. They make it a little bit, the boomers kind of happy, Beach Boys, Gen Xers a little bit more dour, a little bit sadder. And so that, we're just going to use the seeker methodology. We're just going to apply all of this stuff, and that's going to bring in the kids, and it doesn't work. And so what you have after the seeker movement is the emergent movement, and that is where you get the similarities between Mark Driscoll and Nadia Bolz-Weber. And again, you'd look at them and say, how on earth would Mark Driscoll, Nadia Bolz-Weber, and Rob Bell, how can you find the commonality between all of them? But you do. They're all part of the same generation. And Nadia Bolz-Weber sort of becomes, now she's like this leader of evangelization or something. I don't even know if the liberal Lutherans would use that word. I forget what it is. But she's like their poster woman. And Rob Bell is off in Oprah land. And Mark Driscoll, well, we've heard a bunch about him. So And you have the Young Restless and Reform movement, and it's out of that movement that we really get Keller and Piper and the Gospel Coalition, and all of that comes up. And this again is it's really hard. It would be really hard to imagine in the 1980s that the next thing after the Seeker movement would be, among other things, a Young Restless and Reformed movement. And the gospel, as Tim Keller uses it in a particular way, some people have called the Young Restless and Reformed movement sort of neo-puritan, because they really reach back and use a lot of English Puritan language, texts, and they sort of use this theological, pastoral, let's call it a psychotechnology, and it's really a package, and it's been very, very successful for many people. I bumped into it first when someone called me out of the blue, and he's still a friend of mine, and said, "I want you to be my mentor." Who are you? Well, I'm Reformed. Well, okay. Where's your pastor? No, I grew up in this. Grew up in this Anabaptist church, but how did you become Reformed? On the internet. Oh, so we've met over the years, so when Tim Keller says the gospel, it's a very specific thing, that it's a very specific package that Keller used to great effect, and really, given all of his skill, has really sort of laid it out. But it's a very particular thing, and if you listen to hundreds of his sermons, as I have, you learn it. And then if you listen to anyone in that movement, you can sort of identify it, right, Luke? And it's a very particular thing, okay? And what's difficult is that for a lot of Christian Reformed people and a lot of evangelicals, the gospel, that word means something, and it's not far off what the Young Restless and Reformed, Gospel Coalition, neo-Puritans, how they use it. It's not far off. It's just much better focused, and the resolution is higher, and there's a whole pastoral psychology and methodology connected to them that's specific to that movement.
Particular way that has played out in American history.
I found it also really helpful in the paper. Do you call it a paper? It feels like a mini book. It feels like there's a book there, Tim, and I hope one day there will be. Yeah,
I think it's about a half a book.
Yeah.
It's the spine of a book. So yes, thank you. But anyway, what did you say?
It's robust.
And again, I've got all this guy's books. I've read most of them, and some of his books I really treasure. And in the mid aughts, the second half of the mid aughts, I listened to hours of Keller every day for a couple of those years, because I really needed it, and it saved my faith, saved my ministry. Really, I owe this man. I mean, you've seen the deep dive I've done into Jordan Peterson. I did this first into Keller, and so I owe this man a tremendous debt of gratitude for the ways that he's helped me.
Okay. No, but you also trace out racial history and evangelicalism, and make a distinction between white evangelicalism and other forms of evangelicalism, which arguably aren't in the kind of free fall that white evangelicalism is. What is helpful for us to focus on when it comes to race?
And even sort of the way that's sort of put together here. Well, white evangelicalism is defective in the way that these non-whites aren't. Boy, I'll tell you, the stuff going on in the black church, I mean, they're in the midst of a ton of stuff too. And I can't imagine what's going on. So, of course, I've talked to a lot of people in Orthodoxy over the last few years, and you would think from the view of this little corner that Orthodoxy must just be growing great guns in North America. Other people have said, no, it really isn't. Why? because even though we've got people coming in to orthodoxy via the Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Pageau pipeline, you've got immigrants walking away from it. I was watching that show about the Islamic kid growing up in North Jersey, and that's on Hulu. And, as with almost all of these things, the first couple of seasons are good, and the season's kind of degenerated. The first season was good, but it showed the struggle of faith in America. Now, what he gets into later in the second half of this, I think, is really, really helpful. But this analysis of the church, I think, is very dated, because churches tend to hold things and freeze things. And that's in many ways what these institutions are designed to do, to slow things down. And that's a tremendously helpful thing in an age like ours. But so remember earlier when he talked about how the mainline churches in the West are disconnected from their sister churches in the East, and that was a huge thing in the United Methodist Church, where the American United Methodist wanted to evolve on sex and gender, and the African bishops are like, over our dead bodies. And, so suddenly, and I've made this point about the CRC with Synod 2022, that the most progressive aspects of the CRC tend to be also the whitest. That when you looked around Synod 2022, it was young pastors of color and leaders of color who in many ways were making some of the most conservative noises, and many of those really sort of from a neo-puritan, young, restless, and reformed posture, because again, there's a lot of confessional closeness between sort of the neo-Puritans and the Christian Reformed Church. There's a ton of shared DNA in those groups.
And the evangelical church.
Well, we do have... the history is pretty sad. Actually, Mark Knoll has 2 books on that. He does have a book. Oh, I forget the name of it. It's behind me. I think it's the... Oh, dear. He's got a book on race.
And read... I read it. I mean, Mark Knoll's a tremendous historian, and he'll remember it later. The theological conflict of the Civil War, and it's a fascinating read. Oh, I should just play it.
And the church, but I just forget the name. But he's
We'll
also
Google
got,
it and link to it.
Yeah, he's also, if you put in Mark Knoll, Noll, and race, there's a book that actually has the word race in the title. So it's kind of a history of the church and race in our
God
culture.
and Race in American Politics?
That's it. That's the one.
Is that it?
But
Okay.
but there's another one that I think in some ways gets to the question of why is it that white evangelicals are so ambivalent about race? Why do they seem to really wink at white supremacy? I mean, they don't articulate it, but when they hear it, they're not put off by it. And I think
see, now he might be talking to different people than I am, but I don't see that. Maybe it's because I grew up in Patterson in a racial reconciliation church. I went to one in Grand Rapids. I lived in the Dominican Republic. I'm checking off a lot of bingo pieces here. And in Sacramento. And none of that is to say that there aren't significant issues of race in New York, New Jersey, in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in Santo Domingo, in the Dominican Republic, or in Sacramento, California. Race is an issue. But when I listen to his treatment of it, I hear people who were formed by the civil rights movement and the struggles of the 70s, of the 60s and 70s. And I don't see a lot of continued evolution in this. And I don't know, Columbia's just, not too far from Tim. He should really sit down with John McWhorter and, have a conversation about the black church with Glenn Lowry. I don't know that. And again, look at the Pentecostal churches. And again, this isn't to say that there isn't a significant that there aren't significant issues. But when I listen to a lot of this analysis, I hear the issues of the 70s and 80s, and it's been 40 years. And I think while issues remain, I don't think, at least in the North, or at least the Northeast, the Northern Midwest, and the West of the United States, those issues may be in the South. It could very well be. I have no idea. But I think the dynamics are just different.
You have to read Mark Knoll's book, The Civil War as a Theological Crisis. I think that's a fascinating book. In fact, the title is a fascinating.
Yeah, it's a great book. It's well worth reading.
Thing.
Yeah.
And he points out that the rest of the world already had moved on. I mean, for example,
right there. Remember the main line? And these are some of the things that you begin to see and say, it's easy to sort of poke, throw the racist thing at white evangelicals. But you look at the main line, all of this talk about submitting to and incorporating, and, well, what about ask African Anglicans that worship in our facility? Ask them. It's just a much bigger world. And also, a lot of this had tended to be formed in back in the Civil War, in Jim Crow, where America was sort of the conversation was predominantly African American versus white, Hispanic, Asian. When I moved to California, significant more impact from Asian communities. Of course, the Native Americans are just completely forgotten in the mix, which in Canada is a whole different story because, of course, the European immigrant population in Canada and the Native American, there's a far different mix in Canada. So there's just so much more to this. And again, it's a half hour, and I'm sure Keller could dive deeper into it, and we'll have to see it in his book. But this posture and orientation tends to remain. This is Joey's point. Some of you don't know Joey, but this is Joey's point that a lot of the progressivism is really sort of a new conservatism, and it's been certain elements of, especially the boomers, that it's just kind of they're still there with us.
James Thornwell and Robert Dabney, who are two Southern Presbyterians. So I'm going to take responsibility here. Yeah, conservative Presbyterian theologians, Calvinist, very orthodox, and they were absolutely in lockstep theologically with conservative Presbyterians in Scotland. The great leader was Thomas Chalmers, and the Free Church of Scotland, which was a really, really strong church. And theologically, they were exactly the same. But Thornwell and Dabney were making all these arguments about, well, the Bible justifies slavery. Slavery's fine. Look, it says slaves obey your masters. And the Free Church people over in Scotland are saying, you're kidding, right?
And again, this is exactly the conversation that you're having between, let's say, American Episcopalians and African Episcopalians, or American Roman Catholics and African Episcopalian or Roman Catholics are saying, "You're kidding, right?" and part of this says to me is that, and Keller's very upfront with this, your doctrine dogmatic framework will not save you or your church. And some of you, oh gosh, this is a Christian Reformed minister. But I think at the heart of actually the doctrine itself says, no, Jesus saves us, not our doctrine, not our dogma, not our ecclesiology, not our framework. And so Keller will have, he'll tinker with it, but it was just a striking thing when I listened to this on the plane heading down to Southern California. listening to that whole section about how the main line is disconnected. And it's like, then you listen to this part and you have to say, yeah, the Africans are saying to the Americans, you're kidding, right? And it just, that whole thing just says, we need to continue to,
I said, the Bible, look, it says, slavery is something that God in the Mosaic legislation is there. And they look and say, it does say in Deuteronomy that if a slave escapes, you don't return him because it shows they were abused. It says in Exodus that if you hit a slave to punish him and you knock his tooth out, he goes free. It says there that nobody should be a slave more than 6 years. It says there that slavery is never based on, race. And they say, you're kidding, right? And yet what had happened was, because the economy of the South, certainly the prosperous South, the people who had the money, was based on slavery. And there was this enormous pressure on the Christians to justify it and not to undermine it. And you look at somebody like Thornwell and Dabney, because I have read their stuff.
And it goes far beyond just economics.
And at one level, they seem to be extremely sincere and very, very smart. But it's so fascinating that the cultural times shaped the way in which they read the Bible. And people who were not in that spot, they could see that they were being distorted. I mean, people from Scotland, elsewhere, they could see it. And but what happened was they justified it. And then, of course, they had the Civil War, and then they lost. And afterwards, there was a lot of white Southern evangelicals that held on to this self-justifying approach, saying, well, black people, they should be slaves because, look, they're inferior. Look at their poverty. Look at the crime. And
now you should mention, science. What becomes the theological what becomes the justification for the inferiority? It's Darwin and Herbert Spencer.
And that was a very, very powerful moment in American history where the Southern Church should have turned to the Bible and read it. I think.
Now, again, if you read Marsden will make the point that the Southern Church, the old Southern Church, really gets taken apart. And so the Northern Church sort of comes in and replants itself in the South, and that's going to be a very complex thing. And again, the Civil War just sort of sets the stage for a lot of things for the next 100 years.
Think in context read it in connection with other people from other cultures. See, it wasn't that easy to do back then. And said, are we reading this right, or are we just reading our own needs into it? Are we really listening to God's word, or are we kind of eisegeting, reading into it what we want to see? But they failed. They did read it in, and that has infected. I mean, the white evangelicals have always had a strong strain of distrust of other races, and I think it comes down from that. And those two
people have a distrust of other groups. It's not just white evangelicals. Mainline won't listen to Africans. Only the good Africans. And that isn't to say that. So again, it's just, to me, sort of setting up the argument like I saw it set up in the 80s, and it hasn't changed that much since the 80s.
Books by Noel do help us see how that happened, and it's is that our original sin? I don't know. Is that American evangelicals' original sin? I don't know if I go that far. I think we have our own original sin. It's not slavery; it's turning from God, and we all have remaining sin in us. But it's been tremendously tragic, and we're still experiencing it now.
Yeah. Well, another thing we're really experiencing too is politics, and I forget whether it was a New York Times or Atlantic that you wrote for, but you've had a couple of pieces over the last few years.
As if there was a moment we weren't experiencing politics.
Years on the close coupling of conservative evangelicals and the politicization, really, of church. Your thoughts on that and where that becomes problematic and perhaps contribute?
Now I should be as honest with Keller as I have been with Kristen Kobes-Dumay's book. I would love to see in this analysis, and he's touching on it because he's talking about the decline of the main line. You really have to talk about how the main line was the establishment and the continued evolution of the establishment Christianity into, what we've called the blue church.
Leading to the decline of American evangelicalism.
Well, now if you ask why did this politicization happen?
Yeah.
Why is it happening? That's the hardest question you've asked me so far. I think, in fact, I bet it's the hardest question you're going to ask me. So you might want to give yourself a cigar right now.
And as critical as I've been so far, I really love what Keller does with this now because I think it's super helpful.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. This is hard. So let me give you the best answer I can. Liberal democracy, which is how I'm using the word liberal very broadly. Liberal democracy, which is how our Constitution was written, how our country was founded, was the idea that the government is neutral when it comes to religion and religious beliefs. It does not impose religion and religious beliefs on people. It doesn't impose a worldview on people. It doesn't say, it doesn't hook up to Catholicism or Lutheranism or whatever. And therefore, it's big on freedom of association, freedom of speech. It's a pluralistic society, so you have Jews and Catholics and various kinds of Protestants and atheists, and it doesn't impose a worldview or religious views on people, and or moral values on people. And it came out of the Enlightenment because the Enlightenment was born a couple hundred years before America in the wars of religion, when everybody was fighting. Basically, people were dying as to which religion my country is going to be. And a lot
of you will notice a lot of similarity because I've told this story a lot on this channel.
Thinkers of Europe came up and said, "Hey, you know what? Let's create a society in which there's no one religion that is the official religion, and we are coming together just as reasonable people, and we decide how we want to live together. And we park our religion at the door when we come into the public realm, and we make laws based on common good and that kind of thing." And for a very long time, that worked in America. And I just want you to know that that's the problem. The big problem is that liberal democracy is in crisis. And the reason it's in crisis is because, and here's the irony, and I don't think I think I could trace this out if I was writing something down. I think it would be a little hard orally right now to do it.
And I'd love to see him take that on because, again, you're going to have to deal with the main line in this story because the main line evolved. And just saying, okay, the distinction between the main line and the others that they gave up doctrine. I don't think that analysis goes deep enough.
But weirdly enough, liberal democracy kind of led to the decline of religion, probably. Because it really said, religion is okay for your private life, but when it comes to the public life, we really don't need it. It's really not important. We just use science and reason to figure out how we're going to live. And you park your religion at the door when we come out here and talk together. Whether you're a Jew or a Catholic or a Muslim or a Christian or an atheist, you come together and we just decide this. And it was part of I think what weakened faith, because it was really saying faith is a private thing. It just makes you happy, but it really isn't all that necessary for how you live your whole life.
Now that's low resolution, but it's what we've been working on in this little corner of the internet. What on earth do we mean when we talk about faith? How can we get deeper into this question of the faithing part of us and all this materiality down below?
Whatever. But the fact is that when religion started to decline, the thing that now I have some atheist friends who admit this. Say the thing that actually held us together was not freedom of speech, freedom of association, using our reason. What held us together was like 80% of the population went to either a Catholic or a Protestant church. They actually went. And that even though, like, the liberals and conservatives in Congress were arguing over taxes or unions, but they would never argue over same-sex marriage. They all thought it was be a horrible thing. In other words, everybody was and 80-90% of people were nominal Christians. And because they were nominal Christians, they had a moral base, and they lived with the illusion that we're really not a Christian country, we're a secular country. But the fact is, they'd never really had to deal with pluralism using liberal democratic, structure. And when real pluralism came along, we found out we couldn't abide it. And so now here's the first thing that happened. The first group of people that actually moved away from liberal democracy into we're going to impose our worldview on you were the progressives. They were the first people to start doing it. Rowan Williams, Archbishop of Canterbury, former, he calls it programmatic secularism rather than
That's a good one to steal. Programmatic secularism. I haven't said this for a while. I said it earlier in the early days of the channel. I mean, pastors are thieves. We find things like this and we say, I'll take that. Programmatic secularism.
Procedural secularism. In other words, it used to be the government was secular in the sense of being a neutral umpire and said, okay, we want to make sure everybody has a level playing field to make your case and live your lives. But programmatic secularism goes like this. Put it this way. In the 60s and 70s, even the 50s, if somebody wrote a book saying it's okay to be gay, that would probably be not publishable because it would be banned as obscene speech, right? Today, if you try to write a book or say it's not okay to be gay, now it's also condemned as obscene speech, except it's called hate speech.
Now, I should probably share with you something someone just sent to me. Michael Collins, Catholic school has student arrested for expressing Catholic beliefs. And we've seen some of this in the Bay Area. Apparently, this kid stood up and said, no, there's only two genders. Probably should have said two sexes, male and female, and you can't go beyond them. And apparently, it led to the kid getting put in a police cruiser.
And what's happened is there was a kind of hegemony. It wasn't pluralistic. There was a kind of nominal Christian hegemony that really did run things. And when that fell apart, now we realize, well, who's going to get in charge of defining hate speech and obscene speech? And progressives said, we're going to do it. And so what they actually have done is they are imposing a kind of programmatic, hard secularism. And conservatives and Christians have seen that. They say, you know what, you're not being neutral anymore. You're really actually pushing. You're actually saying you have to keep your religion totally, totally private, when our religion doesn't allow that. Now, by the way, it's the same problem with Islam. So they're going to have, the more Muslims that are here, the more problems they're going to have there too. But the issue is that conservatives are pushing back, wrongly, I think, and are saying, yeah, liberal democracy doesn't work. There's a lot of conservatives saying we need Christian nationalism. We actually need to get, the state needs to be overtly Christian, overtly Protestant, or there needs to be, the Catholic integralists say that the Catholic Church should be the state church. And what they're saying is there's absolutely no way to get that moral consensus. We're always going to be fragmented. Liberal democracy doesn't work. And it is a crisis, because the fact is, as long as everybody was a nominal Christian, liberal democracy works, and it doesn't. We're not that anymore. Liberal democracy undermined Christianity and religion in general, and created this situation where we truly are divided. And now the old liberal democratic proceduralism doesn't bring us together. We're just at each other's throats. We have alternate views of reality, totally different views of reality. And I don't have a good way forward. I mean, if you were asking me that question, I'm not going to answer it because I'm actually thinking it out. I still think liberal democracy is way better than Catholic integralism or Protestant Christian nationalism. But I also feel like you've got to call out the progressives, to say this, what you consider democracy actually isn't. It is actually an imposition of your worldview on us. So I feel like we have to call both sides out. But when I do that, I am, maybe Carrie, I am called both sidism, playing, or being, trying to be apolitical when you can't be. I don't think that's possible. But I do think it's fair to say, sorry, right and left, I don't know what the alternative is, but what you are proposing is absolutely wrong. Will never really work. So I told.
And again, anybody who's familiar with, some of the stuff that I've been wrestling with respect to, I still have to do Aaron Wren's second talk, which I'm really looking forward to because I thought there was a lot of good stuff in that talk. But I think he lays out the problem very well here in a very accessible, low resolution way, which again, it's a half-hour talk. And so you can't lean on him too bad. And the guy's fighting stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The fact that he can do this at all is a miracle. But that's where, for me, this sets up the rise of Jordan Peterson. Because when you look at, let me just pull up the video that I released a couple days ago. And I know that I was playing with the definition of natural law because I think, and I've said this many times, go back to C.S. Lewis's book, Miracles. This word nature, like I said, things slip under the words. The definitions move around sort of like this hot spot that's under Yellowstone right now. And it sort of, you go look at a geology thing about the origins of Yellowstone National Park, and, these hot spots move. So nature has been a word that has been a word to watch for the last 800 years. And why so much conservative excitement and progressive angst, really unfounded with many respects, about, well, except for Jordan on Twitter, but about Jordan Peterson. Because I think they're looking for, just like in the Protestant Reformation, when, okay, reason plus text is not resolving the Protestant Catholic fight. There are things underneath. Oh, maybe reason and empiricism together can create a united world. Voltaire noted that the merchants on the docks, whether they be Muslim or Jewish or Catholic or Protestant, seem to get along. And so there's all this desire to use other methods to bring unity and agreement where there are some deep perspectives that are making it very hard for people to cooperate and communicate and be productive and not kill each other or do bad things against each other. Well, I should let him finish because he's going to say something that serves my agenda.
I told you this was the hardest question, and I don't know what you're going to do with it.
So, Tim, that is fascinating. And I guess you could say that for the first time, we really do have a plurality of opinions, right? Like that's what pluralism is. We have divergent opinions. I also know that, you spent a lot of
it's a lot deeper than that.
Time in your active ministry navigating LGBTQ issues and the sexuality of the scripture versus our culture's view. Just to draw that out a little bit more, I know we've talked about identity and how that's become a defining characteristic of this generation. But how do you suggest, because obviously there are people who are affirming who listen to this podcast, there are people who are not, but how do you suggest when you have a different viewpoint than perhaps the culture does, how do you express that in a way that isn't reactionary or angry or inflammatory or completely alienating from the gospel?
Well, you've half answered. I love questions where the question actually gives half the answer.
That was a softball, was it?
It was. I mean, a lot of it has to do with tone. A lot of it has to do with also another thing. A lot of it has to do with the theater that you're in when you're talking. In other words, are you just spouting the world, or are you actually talking to somebody face to face? Are you talking to neighbors? Are you? I think what you have to do is you have to say, "Here's how I see it." But then the best way to do this is to say, "My understanding of your point of view is this," and then when you are done, if the other
Oh, look, we're doing all that whole steel manning thing the IDW was playing with 4 years ago, and it comes out of the therapist's office.
person says that you said that perfectly well, I couldn't have said it better myself, then you can say, well, here's why I don't agree with it, and here's my point of view. I think that in that way you actually have it's face to face. You have people who are talking to each other. I actually, by the way, believe that cadre of people, they do have to spend time together before they would make those videos.
Sorry to cut that off. Someone came through and busted 5 windows, breaking into the rest of the classrooms, only to decide that stealing tables and chairs was not worth it. But doesn't mean don't have to fix the glass. So let's go back.
I think that in that way you actually have it's face to face. You have people who are talking to each other. I actually, by the way, believe that cadre of people, they do have to spend time together before they would make those videos. They actually have to have a lot of these conversations before they make the videos. But I do think you might be able to do something like that, where you are giving people.
You have to build relationships between the people, and you have to improve communication. You're going to have to understand each other if you're going to hopefully arise at something like a new consensus about how to go forward.
Examples of how we ought to be talking to each other, and how we can still live together. So that's the reason why I still believe that liberal democracy, a truly pluralistic society in which the progressives are not actually shutting out religious people, Orthodox Muslims and Christians and Jews who have particular views. But at the same time, there's not some Christian hegemony, some Christian nationalism that's shutting out secular voices or gay voices or anything like that. I don't know how we're not going to have pluralistic society, how we're going to get a pluralistic society unless we change public opinion, which right now is actually trending on both sides away from freedom of speech. It's trending away from this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And that is especially under younger people, both left and right, younger people are not in favor of what us older people would have considered free speech. They are definitely they like speech codes. They like just telling people you can't say those things on both sides. And so what you'd have to do is give people examples, and I think that could be done. I think, on the other hand, I don't know, Carrie, why don't you come up with your list of 10? I actually do know a few, frankly. I'm on a Zoom call fairly often with people on both sides, both religious believers and non-religious people, and liberals and more conservative people and all that actually get together in order to have conversations like this. But it's very...
Getting together in order to have conversations like this. Doggone it, where have we heard that before? If only there was a name for something like that. If only there was like a group of people, enormously diverse. So, again, my estuary is a little unusual because of a variety of things. We tend to have a few more people at mine than most of the others. But most of the people that are at Vendonk's Estuary in Southern California are there from meetup.com. And if you've worked the meetup.com thing, you sort of know that it's a grab bag. And there's a guy who's an immigrant from a Muslim nation. There's a a guy who's he's an African American who teaches literature at the college level. There's a Brazilian guy who's as white as I am. There's with a yarmulke on, and of course we had Jacob last night and Richard, and and then another guy who came in of Asian descent. It was his first time, and everybody around that table, I mean, it's radically different religions, radically different political persuasions. I mean, it was all there in the room last night, and it was a great meeting. It was a great meeting, and we talked, and we have our little Estuary protocol that sort of helps not have the conversation get too dominated by one person or by one thing, and helps the group sort of agree for some ground rules for the conversation, and off we go. And so, and I'm not saying, I talked to Vendonk this morning at breakfast before he took me to the airport. This isn't the be all and end all, but it's a tool and it's a way. And I listened to this and I thought, yeah, I saw a lot of validation in this, because this is what we're doing. We're having these conversations, and I think we are looking at I think behind this movement, there is a real desire for, well, we need a new basis for pluralism. And in this way, Keller and Peterson are on the same page, because neither one of them wants to sort of throw off the sort of a classical liberal posture that says it's best not, and it probably can't be done in this world, to sort of hive off portions of the world again and have the Islamic world and the Christian world and whatever on earth the Chinese are doing, because that's a whole nother question, and on and on and on and on. We're going to have to be able to communicate with each other, because and this is where the Game B people come in, of course, because the stakes are really high. And yeah, so I was pretty excited about this video, and when he ended it this way, I thought, yeah, I think we're on the right track. And so we'll see where this goes. So, as always, I do a video like this, and part of me, I'm going to have it posted in the morning, and I'm going to just kind of, dare I look at Twitter and my YouTube comments after this? It'd be so much easier to just be a standard Christian YouTuber, huh? To just define that little box and keep nailing that little box. But, I've got to be crazy for doing what I'm doing. But I wouldn't do it if I didn't think it was right, if I didn't think it was Christian, if I didn't think it was faithful to the call of Jesus Christ on my life, and faithful to the gospel. I'll say it that way, as a Reformed Christian. So, yeah, I can't wait to hear what y'all are going to say about this.